Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Rise of Western Christendom, Triumph and Diversity, A.D. 200 to 1000, by Peter Brown. Narrated by Tom Parks. Publisher's Note: this audiobook contains references to material present in the print and e-book editions of this book. Preface to the 10th Anniversary Revised Edition. This book is a reprint of a book with a history. It is a history of curiosity and of growing excitement. I first wrote it in the form of a relatively short essay, virtually without footnotes, which appeared in 1996 as part of the series Faire l'Europe, The Making of Europe, directed by Jacques Le Goff. Over the next few years, however, I realized that I could hear behind me the roar of a dam burst. A remarkable surge of publications, of new discoveries, and of new and daring perspectives was underway. It ensured that the centuries associated with the end of the Roman Empire and the first centuries of the Western Middle Ages, between 200 and 1000 A.D., previously dismissed as the Dark Ages, looked very different from how they had done before. New views had emerged. Lively controversies had arisen concerning the rise of Christianity, the fall of the Roman Empire, the origin and expansion of Islam, the conversion to Christianity of Northern Europe, and the establishment of the Empire of Charlemagne. I needed to dive back into the flood and bring these changes in modern scholarship to the attention of readers in an expanded account. This was fully equipped with footnotes and bibliography so that they also could dive in and join in the fun. Hence, what was called a second edition of the book appeared in 2002. It was considerably more than a mere re-edition. The title apart, it was a new book. But the surge in scholarship has continued unabated. It is only proper to pause once again to take breath. In this preface, I will sum up some recent arguments and make available, from the continued mighty flood of publications, an inevitably short selection of recent works. I hope that listeners will find these works helpful to continue the exploration of what has remained a hotly debated period. I do this so as to encourage listeners to wander even more widely in this rapidly evolving and creative field. There, they will find many other outstanding works to which, for reasons of space alone, I was not able to refer. A wider setting. First, let me remind listeners of the shape of the book. It is not a conventional book about Europe, or even about the history of Christianity. I have deliberately set my narrative against a far wider geographical background than that of most accounts. From the very beginning, we meet figures set against a landscape that embraces the whole of Eurasia and northern Africa, from Ireland to China, and from the estuary of the Rhine, and eventually from Iceland to the southern end of the Red Sea. There are good reasons for having done this. For a historian of the ancient world in its last centuries, it is essential to place what we now call Western Europe on the map. In the year 200 A.D., Western Europe was barely perceptible as a distinct region. The Roman West was made up of a series of concentric rings. Its economic center of gravity lay far to the south, in North Africa and in southern Italy. The Mediterranean coastline of Spain and southern France was dotted with settlements that went back to the days of the ancient Greeks and the Carthaginians. By contrast, the lands further north, most of what we now call Western Europe, northern France, Belgium, Britain, the Rhineland, Switzerland, Austria, and Hungary, were still relatively raw territories recently absorbed into the Roman order. Outside these concentric rings lay a further ring, made up, according to the Roman imagination, of feral persons, the barbarians. Altogether, compared with the ancient empires that had grown up around the Mediterranean, in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, and on the Iranian plateau, what we now call Western Europe was a small and marginal region. It lay far to the northwest of the ancient heartlands of civilization. The view from Eurasia. The Roman Empire around the Mediterranean in the west and the Persian Empire between Mesopotamia and Central Asia in the east saw themselves as the two eyes of the earth. Their continued conflict for the control of the Middle East was the only true world war of the period. In sheer mass and destructiveness, the repeated confrontations of Roman and Persian armies made what Europeans call the barbarian invasions appear like mere gang wars. Yet, seen from the vast steppelands of Eurasia and the hot deserts of Arabia and the Sahara, even Rome and Persia seemed small. For Persians and Romans alike, the swath of grazing land inhabited by nomad pastoralists, which swept in an almost unbroken stretch from the plains of eastern Hungary to the northern edge of China, remained a looming presence. These nomads were regarded as the immemorial antithesis to civilization. They were the ultimate barbarians, the barbarians par excellence. Occasionally they made their presence felt. For a short time, as we shall see, the nomadic empire of Attila bullied the Roman Empire and struck fear into the Germanic tribes around the Roman frontiers. The book of Christopher Kelly has taken us into the court of Attila. The work of Peter Heather has traced the destabilizing effect of the Hunnish Empire on the settled populations of the Danube and of Germany. The horizons of the Silk Road. What is less often realized is that the nomad confederacies of the Eurasian steppes acted as Europe's relay system along the long road to China. What we call the Silk Road was never a simple commercial highway, the ancient equivalent of the Trans-Siberian Railway. Instead, goods passed along it in the form of diplomatic interchanges between the great powers, between the empires of Rome, Persia, and China. The stepping stones on this long route were nomadic kingdoms, which patrolled the routes and which absorbed the caravan cities of Central Asia and Western China. Throughout this period, as we shall note, especially in chapters 1, 12, and 13, the material and cultural goods that crossed Eurasia included new religions. The Silk Road was dotted with communities of Christians. Their libraries and churches abutted Buddhist stupas in the middle of great caravan cities. Much of what we know about the beliefs and worldview of the Manichees, a radical sect of largely Christian origin, comes from manuscripts excavated in the oases of the Turpan Depression of Western China. Western tourists who nowadays walk around the great adobe ruins of Gaoqing outside modern Turpan realize with a slight shiver of surprise that here, in the midst of the Taklamakan Desert, Manichaeism, once the most loathed and systematically persecuted of Christian heresies in the Roman Empire, whose radical and exotic doctrines had fascinated the young Augustan in 4th century Carthage, was alive and well, and indeed a state religion in the Uyghur Turkish kingdom of Turpan at a time when Charlemagne ruled in the West. The mobility of Manichaeism and of other forms of Christianity along the Silk Road is a reminder that, for Eurasia as a whole, late antiquity and the early Middle Ages were not a period characterized by insuperable boundaries. Goods, ideas, and persons traveled slowly but surely over huge distances. They crossed ancient political frontiers. They moved with ease across the seemingly unbridgeable frontier between the nomad and the settled worlds. What is a frontier? Looked at from the steppe lands of Eurasia, the Roman frontier along the Rhine and Danube was a non-frontier. Both sides of it were green. No stark ecological chasm divided one side from the other, as the settled world was divided from that of the nomads in Inner Asia, Arabia, and the Sahara. Up to 400 AD, Two very different social orders faced each other across the Rhine and the Danube. But they were not social orders based upon unbridgeable and unchangeable differences in ecology, in technology, and even in mindset. For this reason, the contrast between Romans and barbarians, though it seemed so clear to the imagination of contemporaries, was constantly eroded by the facts of nature. The two groups shared a temperate climate, which ensured that both Romans and barbarians were settled farmers. Like all great rivers, one thinks of the Rio Grande between Texas and Mexico, the Rhine and the Danube were as much joining places as they were dividing lines. The Roman answer to this challenge had been to invent an absolute frontier, where, in fact, no such frontier, such as that traditionally associated with the contrast between nomads and the settled land, existed. They treated all societies outside the political frontier of Rome as barbarians. More than this, they consistently described all barbarians as ultimate barbarians. They treated the Germans as if they were no different from the nomads of the Eurasian steppes. They saw them as rootless, as bloodthirsty, as ever ready to flood the peaceful lands of the empire with murderous bands. And why did they do this? A great scholar of Gaul and of the barbarian side of the Rhine frontier, John Drinkwater, has recently provided a cogent answer. He argues that emperor, military, and civilian populations alike needed the idea of a barbarian threat to justify their own existence. The threat of invasion justified high rates of taxation. It justified the splendid palaces and cities ringed with high walls which overlooked the Rhine and the Danube from the North Sea to the Black Sea. It gave a raison d'etre to a powerful and well-paid military class. Above all, it enabled the emperor to stand tall as the defender of civilization. By working on both sides of the frontier, through the patient analysis of Roman sources checked against the findings of recent archaeology, Drinkwater has concluded that much of this was a bluff. The guard on the Rhine, mounted along the Roman side of the frontier, which the imperial establishment sold so successfully to contemporaries and to later historians, was an artifact. Alas, as Drinkwater points out, the imperial establishment did their job only too well. Like the ancients, we still seem to need the Germanic boogeyman. Altogether, the Roman government had a way of rendering absolute boundaries that were, in reality, extremely permeable. A brilliant and closely argued monograph by the late Yves Moderon has shown this happening also in North Africa. Through careful reading of the texts produced by Roman writers in late antique Africa, he shows how an ideological iron curtain came to be erected between Romans and Berbers, known to contemporaries as Moors. For much of the time, Romans and the Berbers of the mountainous hinterland of North Africa had coexisted. The Berbers were accustomed to a symbiosis with the Romans of the coast. Most of them had become good Christians. They gathered in churches, many of which dated from the days of St. Augustine. It looked as if joint Romano-Berber kingdoms would take over the Maghreb after the fall of Rome. The union of rough mountaineers with civilian Roman populations was not unlike the fusion of Romans and barbarians which had brought the Franks to power in northern Gaul. The arrival of the armies of the East Roman Emperor Justinian brought all that to an end. Seizing Carthage from the Vandals in 535, the East Roman government adopted, in Africa, the attitude that had been current in Gaul and elsewhere in the 4th century. The Moors, the Berbers, were declared to be beyond the pale. They were treated as outer barbarians. Latin authors writing in Carthage in the late 6th century wrote of these Berber Christians as if they were in no way different from the wild, pagan nomads of the Sahara. One wonders what the history of the Maghreb would have been like if Justinian had not brought the Roman Empire, with its all-too-Roman attitudes to the outside world, back to Carthage, and if an ideological Iron Curtain had not been put in place between the Mediterranean coast of Africa and its wide hinterland. Perhaps, so Modéran speculates, a Berber Clovis might have emerged, as the end product of many generations of quiet symbiosis between Romans and settled Moors in that large and distant land which had once been so close to Rome. Altogether, a wide geographical focus which is prepared to look at both sides of the Roman frontiers helps to keep what we usually call the age of the barbarian invasions in perspective. In many parts of the Roman West, and especially in Northwest Europe, this period is better described as the age of the redrawing of notional frontiers after the evaporation of a grand illusion. The illusion of an unbridgeable difference between Romans and barbarians, which had been fostered along the frontiers of the empire. Christianity and Europe. But there is a further reason for the unusual geographical spread of this book. It is crucial to do justice to the diversity of the many Christianities of this time. For the entire period, from 200 to 1000, Christianity remained predominantly a religion of Asia and of northern Africa, though well established in parts of the western Mediterranean, and not least in large cities such as Rome and Carthage. Christianity spread slowly throughout the non-Mediterranean West. What we now call a distinctively European Christianity was unthinkable in the year 500 AD. Even the notion of Europe itself only took on its modern meaning in around the year 650 AD, as we will note at the end of chapter 11. By the year 1000 AD, what could be called a European Christianity had only recently been established, with the conversion of Germany, of parts of Eastern Europe, and of Scandinavia. The drama of the expansion of Christianity into northwestern Europe should not blind us to the fact that, seen from the viewpoint of the older, more deeply rooted Christian populations of North Africa, Egypt, Asia Minor, Syria, the Caucasus, and Mesopotamia, what we call Western Christendom was out on a limb. It was the Christianity of a peripheral zone. It is important to do justice to this fact. In recent times, many Europeans have wished to insist that Europe is a Christian civilization. They claim that the centuries covered in this book are of particular importance, for it was then that the Christian roots of Europe were planted. It is not my intention to foster this self-congratulatory myth. A Europe with only Christian roots would be a very airless place, even for Christians. One might indeed say particularly for Christians. For throughout this period, so many Christians wrestled with remarkable creativity with the fact that they lived in a society whose roots were not Christian. We begin in the early 5th century at the end of chapter 3 with Augustine of Hippo, as he strove to find a place for the earthly city and for the values of this world, of the saeculum, in his monumental City of God, as the late Robert Marcus has shown in a series of lucid and deeply committed studies. We continue in chapter 14 and again in chapter 20 with the learned men of Ireland and elsewhere from the 7th century onward, as they faced a world where so much that was essential to their own position in society was resolutely pre-Christian. The roots of northern societies, Irish, Anglo-Saxon, German, and Scandinavian, reached back into times of yore, to a prestigious dream time before the coming of what the Irish called the blessed white language of the Christian Scriptures. The constant presence of a profane, pre-Christian world, which pushed deep roots into the past and into the hearts of Christian believers, provided the populations of what we now call Europe with an invaluable structural reserve, a space for the profane that could be constantly drawn upon. Without the tenacity of its gnarled, pre-Christian roots, modern Europe would have lacked the imaginative and intellectual roughage provided by an unresolved tension between the sacred and the profane. A Europe which grew only from Christian roots would have been a sadly anemic Europe. Furthermore, modern insistence on the Christian roots of Europe has led to a subtle and dangerous slippage. Only too often, accounts of the Christianization of Western Europe are written not as if Europe had Christian roots, but rather as if Christianity itself had only European roots. Despite the fact that the principal focus of this book is the slow emergence of a distinctive version of Christianity in Western Europe, I trust that the listener will realize that the geographical spread of this book was intended to head the listener off from European chauvinism of this kind. The Greek and Middle Eastern world is present throughout the first 4 chapters. Chapters 12 and 13 are devoted specifically to the Christianities of the Middle East, before and after the rise of Islam. Chapter 17 examines the crisis of Byzantine society in the 8th and 9th centuries, associated with the iconoclastic controversy. What I would like to emphasize in this preface is that to do otherwise, to treat the Christianities of Byzantium, Africa, and Asia as if they formed only a distant and exotic backdrop to an exclusively European story, would be to miss one of the most exciting scholarly opportunities of the last 10 years. Progress in the discovery of documents from the past of Western Christianity has been slow. Of course, there have been some significant discoveries. In the field best known to me, that of the Africa of St. Augustine, pleasant surprises continue to happen. More sermons of Augustine have been discovered to add to those previously discovered and published in the 1990s by François Dolbeau. Many anonymous sermons have been identified as coming from Africa in the 5th and 6th centuries, which adds an exciting new dimension to an African Christianity that is usually overshadowed by the mighty figure of Augustine. As we will see, great strides have been made in interpreting the abundant parchment literature and documentation of the late Merovingian and Carolingian periods. A New Frontier: The Christianities of the East. But these discoveries pale in comparison with advances in the study of the Christianities of the Middle East. Here, a new world has been opened up. Manichaean documents in Coptic continue to be published, not least those found among the houses recently excavated in the Dakhla oasis of southern Egypt. An entire Christian culture of remarkable wealth and diversity, attested in Syriac, has come to be studied as never before. Hitherto unknown Syriac manuscripts have come to light. Many of them are preserved in areas, such as Iraq and Syria, where recent events have made the fate of the Christian communities uncertain. What is at stake is the survival of the relics of an ancient Christian culture, directly inherited from the days of late antiquity. Many manuscripts date back to a time when Syriac was one of the most widespread learned languages of Asia. Many exciting research initiatives have opened up to scholars. For example, those who want to savor the riches of this culture in the form of digitalized manuscripts, expanded catalogs, constantly updated bibliographies, and detailed topographical studies that reveal an entire forgotten landscape, can now turn to the Syriac Reference Portal website directed by Professor David Mickelson of Vanderbilt University with the help of an international team of collaborators. The creation of this Syriac Reference Portal shows how the field has come to attract growing numbers of scholars who are anxious to explore an abundance of new evidence and to propound new perspectives. It represents the opening of a new frontier in Christian studies and in studies of the pre-Islamic and Islamic Middle East. In light of this abundant evidence, a new generation of young scholars has begun to rewrite the history of Christianity in the Byzantine Empire and the Middle East. To take one major example of a change of view, the Monophysite opponents of the Council of Chalcedon are no longer seen, as they had been through Greek and Latin eyes, as no more than excitable Orientals who severed themselves from the collective wisdom of the Catholic and Orthodox world so as to retreat into inflexible and peripheral minority churches. This has been shown to have been far from the case. As opponents of the Chalcedonian state church of Byzantium, dissident Monophysite churchmen developed a robust sense of Christian community detached from the incubus of empire. The Monophysite dissidents produced great theologians, ascetic heroes, and masters of spirituality. Nor were these debates confined within the frontiers of the Roman and Sasanian empires. An entire world has emerged, far to the south of the conventional boundaries of Rome and Persia. In Yemen and Ethiopia, the clash of various forms of Christianity with Judaism created in the 6th century a situation of religious war that was conducted with an ideological fury that anticipated the spirit of the Islamic Jihad and of the medieval Christian Crusades. A common market of ideas. Above all, the warring Christian churches of Asia and Africa turned the Middle East into a vast echo chamber, resounding with lively conversations. The literature of every church was characterized by debates with real or imagined rivals, and by lists of questions and answers addressed to the learned by the faithful. Such constant debate and questioning created a common language of thought which embraced all faiths, local languages, and regions. It was the cyber highway of the age. In the 6th and 7th centuries, the common language of thought reached from Alexandria to the Iranian plateau, bridging the frontier between Rome and Persia to include the entire Middle East in a new common market of ideas. The men who contributed to this common market cared deeply about education. Based in the city of Nisibis, Nusaybin in modern Turkey, the Nestorian Christians of the Church of the East created an entire new system of Christian schooling. News of the distant schools of Nisibis greatly impressed Westerners such as Cassiodorus. They also cared about the Greco-Roman past. In the great Monophysite monastery of Keneshra, the nest of eagles beside the Euphrates, a learned man such as Bishop George of the Arabs could still pass on to his colleagues recondite information on the origin of the name of the river Tiber. This was in the 720s. That is, in the last days of the Merovingian dynasty in Gaul, and nearly 100 years after the Muslim conquest of the Middle East. The entry of Islam. This brings us to Islam. And when it comes to Islam, as we all know, modern attitudes have changed dramatically in the last 10 years or so. The listener should know that Chapter 13, on the Christian communities under Islamic rule, was prepared and written before the tragic events of September 11, 2001. These events, and the wars and state of alarm which have followed them, have brought Islam to the forefront of the concerns of Europeans and Americans alike. Inevitably, these terrible events created a fraught situation, characterized by the revival of ancient prejudices and by urgent demands for quick answers. Yet the scholarship of the last 10 years has been marked by remarkable and dispassionate advances in our understanding of the first centuries of Islamic rule in the Middle East. These advances have linked up with the surge of scholarship that has revolutionized the study of Syriac Christianity in the periods both before and after the Islamic conquests. Altogether, the theme of late antiquity and Islam is in the air. We need only consult the superb catalogue of the exhibition entitled Byzantium and Islam: A Transition, which took place in 2012 in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, to realize how much the study of the relations between Islam and the rich cultures of the pre-Islamic Middle East has advanced since the beginning of this century. Why has this been so? It is largely because we no longer treat Islam and Christianity as if they were totally incommensurable, as if they were hermetically sealed entities incapable of communicating with each other. I trust that I made plain in Chapter 13 that Islam was not a phenomenon that came out of the blue. The roots of
Sample complete. Ready to continue?